September 1939, the German foe begins its ruthless march of conquest and sets the stage for World War II.
Michael, hi, how are you? Welcome.
Good.
Thank you for joining us on Yom HaShoah. I think there's no better person for JLTV to have on than you to explain to everybody who doesn't know, or even though people who do know, the ramifications of this day, Yom HaShoah, which I think, if I'm correct, started in 1952.
The question is, what should be Holocaust Remembrance Day? And that was a tremendous debate. You could begin by saying January 30th should be Holocaust Remembrance Day. That's the day Hitler came to power. No Hitler, no Holocaust. One could begin by saying September 1, 1930, September 1 should be Holocaust Remembrance Day because no World War II, the day the war began, no Holocaust. One could say that January 20th should be Holocaust Memorial Day, and that's because on January 20th you had the Wannsee Conference, January 20th, 1942, and the Wannsee Conference was the day in which the Holocaust took a new turn. Instead of mobile killers going to stationary victims, they reversed the process and they created the death camps, and they began to move well into the murder process. One could say, for example, that November 9th through 11th would be Holocaust Memorial Day, Kristallnacht, the November pogroms. The Israelis were pushing the secular Israelis were pushing that Holocaust Remembrance Day should be as close to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was April 19th, the first day of Passover. If you established it on the first day of Passover, Jews would live in a contradiction that was too acute, too impossible. They would have to celebrate the Exodus and liberation and at the same time the Shoah and decimation and destruction. So they came to a political compromise, which was to push the Holocaust Remembrance Day beyond the week of Passover, but as close to April 19th as possible. They chose the 27th of Nisan, which is a day after Passover that can never occur on Shabbat, close enough in proximity to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And the original notion of Yom HaShoah was it was Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, Holocaust and Resistance Day, Holocaust and Heroism Day, because of the resistance of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The world now commemorates January 27th, which is the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet troops, as International Holocaust Remembrance Days. And many other countries have their own Remembrance Day. For example, March 11th is the Remembrance Day in North Macedonia because Macedonian Jewry was decimated and brought to monopole on March 11th. Other countries have other days, but for the Jewish people, the day is the 27th of Nisan, which always occurs right after the conclusion of Passover and is commemorated worldwide by the Jewish community. This year is especially important because it's the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and Yom HaShoah coincides with the secular date for the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And as we continue our conversation, I want to set the scene of what April 1943 was like, because April 1943, you had many things going on at the same time. In the United States, that was when the great pageant occurred, We Shall Never Die, which was the attempt led by people like Peter Bergson and Ben Hecht, with the help of somebody like Arthur Szyk, the great illustrator, and people like Edward G. Robinson, Clark Gable, Paul Muni, a whole range of actors from Hollywood to call attention to the plight of the Jews. In Belgium, it was the 20th train en route to Auschwitz was stopped, and resistance broke out by a brilliant young Jewish doctor in training, a physician in training, who figured that he could stop a train by just signaling a red light. Stood with a lantern and a red light, the train stopped, and then he had a group board the train and open the doors and give them the opportunity to leave. In Bermuda, there was an international conference on the 20th of on this day in April of 1945, and it was coinciding with Passover to keep Jews away. And it was held in Bermuda because Bermuda was a closed island at that point. And the world gathered, the leadership of the United States, of Great Britain, gathered at that point to consider what to do about the refugees. And as you know, very well know, nothing very much was done. And finally, in Warsaw, this was the day in which Jews went from the Passover Seder into armed uprising against the Germans, because April 20th was Hitler's 54th birthday, and Himmler wanted to present Hitler with a gift for his 54th birthday, which was a Judenrein, a Jew-free Warsaw. So German troops surrounded the ghetto. They were helped by Ukrainian troops as well. And they had trains in the Umschlagplatz, in the deportation point, ready to go to liquidate, to destroy the entire ghetto. And that's the moment when the Jews rose in armed rebellion.
But that takes care of the physical stuff. Let's talk a little about, as you know, Michael, I'm from Hungary, and I'm actually doing this program from Hungary in Budapest. And we had a Yom HaShoah memorial here as well. I lost about 80 relatives, including my paternal grandparents and my paternal and two aunts, my father's sisters. Every Hungarian Jew like myself has dozens of people that they lost, whether grandparents or other. So we're all affected physically. And here I am at 75 years of age. I've known about the Holocaust since I was 4 or 5 years old. I knew that these grandparents were not around, and I asked my father, well, where are my grandparents? And he explained to me about Auschwitz. He explained to me about being in Mauthausen, which he survived. So by 70 years, I have been in my kishkas with the Holocaust. You, as a professional historian, as a rabbi, you've been working on this also for 3 decades, and I don't think there's anybody right now alive with more knowledge about what has happened. But not just knowledge. I know you very well, and I know how emotionally this whole thing affects you. And I wonder, when you and I are gone and we're Sadrer, I wonder if there's going to be anybody who is going to be doing a program like this. I'm not so sure. Michael, let's continue this question I have from you in a few minutes, because we need a commercial break. So hold on, Michael. Welcome back, and I'm glad the audience is back as well, and I hope you stayed. My last question was, who is going to do this after you and I are
Well,
long gone?
I'm happy you asked, and I'm pleased you asked because I have an answer. I have in my office, as we're speaking, a young, brilliant documentary filmmaker who did a fabulous film, and he's here because we're working this afternoon on a film on Treblinka. See, I teach, and not only do I teach, but I spend a good deal of my life trying to mentor the younger generation to remember. And we now have an entire generation that is deeply committed to memory. Um, we're about to enter, as we record this, the last days of Passover. And when Passover ends, I will be going directly to Poland for the March of Living, which will bring 12,000 young people from all over the world, from countries that you don't think of as having large Jewish populations like Costa Rica and Panama, even Cuba, Israel, the United States, and all of the European countries, Argentina, the Latin American countries, all of the European countries will bring 12,000 youngsters to Auschwitz. They will march between Auschwitz and Birkenau, and they will be part of a generation that absorbs the memory. Now, clearly, we are about to lose the survivor generation. And when we lose the survivor generation, it means we're moving between lived history and historical memory. But the heir of that historical memory are going to be some great institutions that have been created, and also a whole range of individuals that understand the Holocaust, that probe the Holocaust, that explore the Holocaust, and see a deep and profound meaning in the Holocaust, and try to present it to the next generations and also to the American public in general. I'm speaking from Los Angeles. We now have an exhibition open called Auschwitz Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. It's open at the Ronald Reagan Library, not exactly a place you would think of as the heart of the Jewish community. And they are sold out for the next 3 months. Why are they sold out?
Amazing.
Because people are interested in the Holocaust. And Auschwitz is a title. As you know, Auschwitz is the world capital of evil. It's the most sacred, anti-sacred place on the globe. Auschwitz itself draws 2 million people, and an exhibition that we have on Auschwitz is drawing people all over the place. And most of the visitors, almost all of the visitors, are non-Jews interested in the Holocaust and interested in learning. And even the person who put the exhibition together, Louis Ferrara, is a Spanish Jew. And Spain, remember, was untouched by the Holocaust. They were too exhausted by what happened in the Spanish Civil War to be able to fight. So I'm much more optimistic. I am pessimistic about one thing, which is I wish that I was speaking about the past. But when we speak about the Holocaust, we have echoes of the present and foreboding feelings about the future. Let's give you an example. When we created the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in 1993, and it's now 30 years old, we were living at a time when democracy was on the rise. Totalitarian Soviet Union had fallen, and every one of the countries, Hungary, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, all of these countries were all of a sudden experiencing what? East Germany, the great joy of democracy and the great blessing of freedom. We're now in a world where democracy is fragile, and we have to explore what happened between 1918 and 1933 in what took Germany from a democracy into a polarized authoritarian government and ultimately into a totalitarian government capable of committing genocide. So all of a sudden we have, unfortunately, less confidence in the future of democracy and less confidence in the stability of the world. And again, an explosion of hatred that is taking place, and anti-Semitism is rising in our world today as well.
Yeah, it is. It is very foreboding. Let me ask you a question. I was reading just the other day. What is this agreement that Israel made with the Polish government?
That's an interesting question. Let me give it to you very briefly. The Poles have a extreme right-wing government that is trying to essentially say, and on this, they want to say three things. On two of the things, they're correct. On one of the things, they're shading the history. They want to say that Poles were victims of Nazism, and ultimately, they even want to claim victims of the Holocaust. And it's true that Poles were victimized. They were invaded and occupied in 1939, and Poland became the site of death camps, but they are not Polish death camps, as President Obama once mistakenly said, and as many people mistakenly say. They are Nazi death camps in German occupied Poland. Poland then wants to claim its own victimization without coming to terms with the second part, which is that though many Poles objected to the German occupation, they did not object, and some collaborated, participated, and took part in, and indeed enjoyed the fruits of the German implementation of the final solution to the Jewish problem. So they want the Israeli youngsters to go and to see some of the good sides of Polish behavior without understanding the dark side of what happened in Poland, which included betrayal and collaboration and participation in the murder of their Jewish communities.
Let's hold this right now. The sponsor is scratching my back, so please hold on to this thought and please come back to us in a few minutes. This is a special program today. It's Yom HaShoah, and our special guest is historian, rabbi, teacher, friend, Michael Berenbaum. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you.
The last thought, please finish.
Well, again, the Poles are seeking to whitewash their own responsibility and to cast all blame on the Germans for what happened. You know, Steve, because you're in Budapest now.
This is whitewash country. There's more whitewash here than in any paint store in America.
And you understand what the Hungarians are trying to do. Let's first begin by setting the stage for the Holocaust in Hungary. The Holocaust in Hungary becomes enormously perplexing when you consider that up until 1944, Jews were persecuted, but they weren't killed. March 19th, 1944, Germany invades Hungary. And then in March and April, they ghettoized the Jews. And between the 15th of May and the 8th of July, 437,402 Jews are deported primarily to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where more than 8 in 10 were killed upon arrival. So the Holocaust in Hungary intensified. 54 days, 147 trains, an average of 2,950 Jews were sent to Auschwitz each day, 2.75 trains per day. It happened in 1944 when everybody knew that Germany was going to lose the war. And it happened in 1944 when Germany was fighting a two-front war. The Allies were invading from Italy. The Allies were invading after June 6th 1944, they were invading continental Europe from France. The Soviet Union was invading from the east, and Germany used that moment to murder its the Hungarian Jewish population. Now, the Hungarians.
Just a second. With very few troops, Eichmann had very few troops. Without the Hungarian help, it would never happen.
The Hungarians now want to blame it all on the Germans without speaking about the Iron Guard, without speaking of the role of the anti-Semites and of the formal participation of Hungarians in the murder of their own Jewish community. And you know that you have historians now, or quasi-historians in Hungary, who are rewriting even the exhibitions in the Holocaust Museum to exonerate the Hungarians and to blame it all on the Germans. And there's this magnificent memorial on the Danube of the boots, the empty boots, because in the fall of 1944, and the details of this are incredible. They tied Jews up and they put them into the Danube, and then to save ammunition, they shot every other Jew, and then the Jew in between would drown by the weight of those who had been shot. This was not done by Germans. It was not done by formal German Nazis. It was done by Hungarian troops and by Hungarian Iron Guard.
Hungarian Arrow Cross.
The Hungarian Arrow Cross was doing this, and now you have the attempt to forget about this memorial, to forget about what the role of Hungary was. And look, we have an attempt all over the world of people who don't want to confront their own painful history, and their own history, which is less than heroic. And in this case, it's we don't even want to call it less than heroic, which is awful, evil, terrible, and participatory, and collaborationist, and enablers, and facilitators, because they want to what? They want to claim a certain type measure of heroism. And this is a phenomenon of revisionism, not Holocaust denial, but Holocaust minimalization and rewriting of history that is taking place in several countries. By the way, the exception to this, ironically, is Germany, which accepts responsibility for what it did in the past and has decided we don't want to be like them. We want to be a democratic society that respects human rights and human dignity. And therefore, Germany has a Jewish community that is increasing in size. There's a sizable Israeli population living in Berlin and finding themselves able to live a Jewish life in Germany, something that would have been unpredictable because Germany remembers its past. In the 1990s, France had to reshape its own understanding of its own history. France originally spoke about the greatness of the resistance, and then with the trial of Barbie, had to deal with collaboration, and then even discovered that its former president, Mitterrand, had not only not been a hero of the resistance, but he had been a collaborator with the Nazis, and they had to begin to understand that they were participants in the Holocaust and not just its victims.
Michael, please come back in a few minutes. We do one more commercial break. Welcome back. We have Michael Berenbaum with us today. It's Yom HaShoah, and remember by illuminating what has happened in the past, but also Michael and I are talking about what's happening today and some foreboding for the future. Michael, hi.
Good being with you, Steve.
Please continue with your thoughts.
Well, we also had in America a very recent experience, which is we had the great documentary filmmaker of our generation, Ken Burns, did a documentary, a 6-hour documentary on the America and the Holocaust, which really told us the fact that America told us something about America that we weren't very happy to learn, though those of us who worked on the Holocaust have known for a long time that America's response to the evolving rise of Nazism and ultimately to the murder of the Jews was, to put it mildly, ineffective, and impotent. Some would even say almost deliberately so, that anti-Semitism was prevalent at that point. We did not open ourselves to refugees. And indeed, there were those who wanted to keep the Jews out of the United States. And Ken Burns successfully pursued that and successfully did that. And for 3 nights on national television on PBS, we faced what was wrong with America during this period of time.
Yeah, that was a very good program at Ken Burns. On May the 4th, Michael, I'm going to Vienna, and the Austrian Parliament is hosting the Mensch Foundation. We will be giving posthumously the Mensch Award to Simon Wiesenthal and also to the 11th Armored Division, which liberated Mauthausen on the 5th of May. My father was in Mauthausen. He was one of the people who was liberated, and so was Simon Wiesenthal. Obviously, they did not know each other, but they happened to have shared the same experience. And the Australian Parliament is hosting the Mensch Foundation for this Mensch awarding at the Austrian Parliament. And if you're in the neighborhood, come in for some strudel.
And let's remind our listeners, our audience, that Simon Wiesenthal was the great Nazi hunter, the man who dedicated the second half of his life after he came out, the second half of his life to finding and bringing to justice the Nazis, because he felt civilization could not be rebuilt unless there was a measure of justice. Consequently, he didn't participate in the assassination of Nazi war criminals, but he did participate in their being apprehended and their being brought to trial. And American troops liberated Mauthausen, and Mauthausen was unique because it had a very distinct form of torture. There was 186 steps between the quarry and the camp, and the slave laborers had to march up those steps carrying heavy stones. And every once in a while, a man at the top of the steps would just use his foot. A Nazi official top of the steps would use his foot and kick the lead person, who would fall backwards, and everybody would fall down many of those steps, each of them carrying a 20-pound or 40-pound boulder. So it was a form of work by torture that took place.
But they also had a gas chamber.
They had a gas chamber which was not used for gassing, but they had a crematoria that was used to destroy the bodies because people had been murdered in such quantity that they could not bury them and could not even quite burn them alive.
My father, when he was liberated, he was 41 years old, and he weighed 98 pounds, 6 feet tall. And if he did not get some porridge the day before May 5th, he would have been dead. He basically hardly survived an American army, which was the savior. Interestingly enough, Ben Ferenc died at age 103, the last one to be involved in the prosecution at Nuremberg, and he was there. I believe he was 26 years old. He was there with the 11th Armored Division when Mauthausen was liberated.
Well, Ben Ferenz, who just died this week at 103, was the last living prosecutor of Nuremberg, was an incredible human rights activist who worked for the establishment of an international court. But we have to understand how Ben Ferenz got into this because it's an interesting story. He was a young Harvard law student who was asked to research for a professor international law on human rights and on the role on the nature of law of warfare. And he became an expert on this, drafted into the Army not as a lawyer, Harvard graduate, but drafted in the Army as a plain private. And then the Army discovers that not only does he know international law and human rights law, but he also knows German fluently. And they assigned him later on to the Nuremberg trials. He comes to General Telford Taylor and he says, I have evidence that I can prove that 2 million Jews were murdered, and I have the documentary evidence of the German officers, of the SS people, essentially signing this and reporting it back to base. And Telford Taylor says, I can't spare anybody. And Ben Ferenz, at the age of 27, 5'2" at the most, maybe 5'1", says, then I'll do it. He brings them to trial, brings 22 men to trial. And what's remarkable is his case was made in 2 days. He asked 2 questions. Do you recognize this document? And is this your signature at the bottom of the document? And he had what we call the Einsatzgruppen reports, the reports of the mobile killers. And of the 22, all 22 were convicted, the most famous of which was a man by the name of Otto Ohlendorf, who was the former director of the Institute of War Economy, who had 2 PhDs. So he's what we would call in Vietnam terms the best and the brightest. And he was involved as the leader of the Einsatzgruppen, murdering hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, and children, bullet by bullet by bullet, town by town, village by village, hamlet by hamlet. And he signed his name to it. He did the documents. And little Ben Ferenz, whom I call a little man but a giant among men, brought him to trial. And in the last day before Ohlendorf was hung, and I've heard Ben Ferenz tell the story, he went to Ferenz and he went to Ohlendorf and he said, tell me, is there anything you would like to say? And Ohlendorf said, yes, I'd like, he thought he would say a final word to his wife, to his family. Ohlendorf said, we must still get the Jews. Ferenz turned his back, walked away, and I can only imagine what he said under his breath at that moment.
Michael, again, our sponsor is knocking on my door. Please forgive me. Come back in a couple of minutes. Oh, we are back again. Hi, Michael. We're back to Never Forget on Yom HaShoah with historian, rabbi, all around decent human being, a mensch, Michael Berenbaum.
Well, my mother would instruct me. I tell a funny story. My first award in the media was called a Silver Angel Award. What do you do when you get a Silver Angel Award? You can't tell your wife because your wife understands you're not an angel. She wants you to put toothpaste on the cap on the toothpaste and to lower and raise the seat at the appropriate thing. And she would say, my angel, would you take out the blank garbage? can't tell your your teenage children because they believe you're the devil incarnate. So I did the only honorable thing a man could do under such circumstances, which is I called my mother of blessed memory. My mother said, "I know you're an angel now. Try being a mensch." So
Try being a mensch.
when I think of the Mensch Foundation, I think of my mother's admonishment: try being a mensch.
Try being a mensch.
But
Yeah.
we were talking before commercial break about. Remember, this was Hitler's last word. Hitler's last
Or
word in his last will and testament was, above all, he enjoyed the German people. Do not forget about the Jews. And to complete the destruction of the Jews, it became an obsession with him, something that he was committed to from the time he was a young soldier. And we have a seamless record from 1919 to 1945 of Adolf Hitler's commitment to get rid of the Jews, by which at first he did not mean to murder them all, but to force them to leave. But it was a seamless conviction that ultimately defined his life.
it's very difficult to understand, Michael. It's very difficult for any human being, Jewish or not Jewish, to understand how deep this hatred can go in some people, or the hatred towards anybody. It's very
Well,
difficult to understand for a human being can hate another person because of their religion, their color, their sexual orientation, any reason. How
but
how how
uh,
does this work psychologically?
Steve, we have to understand that it happens. And these
It
are
happens.
normal people, and they're also normal people who love their own wives, love their own children, and can abuse other people's wives, kill and enslave other people's children. You know, there's a famous story of Robert J. Lifton. Robert J. Lifton is a great psychoanalyst who was investigating Nazi doctors,
Right.
and he had a conversation. He was going out to interview the child of a Nazi doctor, and he was speaking with Elie Wiesel, and Elie Wiesel said, "Tell me something, Bob. Were these people human when they did what they did, or were they demonic?" And Lifton answered him, and he said, "No, not only were they human when they did what they did, but they were doctors, and that's the reason I am investigating them." And
That's
Wiesel's
right.
comment on that, as only Wiesel could say, it's demonic that they were not demonic, meaning these were not monsters. These were ordinary people who had swallowed into an ideology, absorbed an ideology that was a genocidal ideology. And the reason we study the Holocaust is precisely because it can be done elsewhere, not
Look
precisely
at
in that,
what
but genocide is a recurring phenomenon.
look at what Putin is doing in the Ukraine. Look at what, and it's not just him; it's his generals, people under him.
And it's the foot soldiers, and Putin himself is using a quasi Nazi justification. He's saying we're going fighting against Nazism with Ukraine,
Crazy,
which has a
absolutely.
Jewish president. And
And they take
if you look,
children from parents and take them back to Russia. It's crazy.
which is one of the definitions of genocide, it's what the Germans did to the children of Zamość. In Poland, they adopted the blonde haired, blue eyed, intellectually superior children, and they raised them as honorary Aryans. They had them adopted. And you know, the most interesting thing psychologically is if, God forbid, a child is kidnapped, you never come to peace with that because you always believe that you may bump into your child again. So for the rest of your life, these people from Zamość, these parents from Zamość, if they saw anybody who was the age of their child, the color of their child, had whatever color hair or whatever color eyes, they thought that could be my child returning home. And sadly, 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 these children did not return home. And think also of the people who adopt, quotation marks, these children, who are really dealing with stolen children. And that's happening today. And by the way, it's not only the Russians. Look at what the Chinese are doing with the Uyghurs.
It's our last break, Michael. Please bear with me. Don't go away. Hold on to your hat. We're coming back. Oh, here we are for our last 4 minutes with Michael Berenbaum.
We observe Yom HaShoah not only to remember the past, but to remind ourselves of what our responsibility is to the present and the future. And therefore, observing Yom HaShoah has become not only important for Jews, but important for the general community. And Yom HaShoah is observed as days of remembrance in churches and synagogues and even a couple of mosques throughout the United States, because we believe if we remember this past in its awesomely terrible evil, we can somehow commit ourselves to being better in the future, more decent, more loving, more caring, and to feel responsible for the fate of other people, not only for ourselves in the most narrow sense of the term. So part of what we say is, when we say never again, we can't say that as an accomplishment. We have to say that as an admonition to ourselves and to the world. And we have to say, not with our acquiescence, not with our agreement, not with our silence, but with our active indignation at the events that are taking place in our world, that echo, that reflect, that grapple with, that somehow are part of the world of genocide.
I'd like to dedicate our program not only to the memory of my lost relatives, not only to the memory of 6 million Jews, but also I'd like to dedicate it to the people of Ukraine who are now suffering every day and dying because there's an evil in the Kremlin, and there's other people besides him. Putin could not do this alone, and I hope someday they will get some sense of justice, like what Ben Ferenc did at Nuremberg.
All I can say to that is amen. Thank you, Steve. It's been a privilege to be with you.
Amen, Sei gesund, and thank you for being here today. And thank you for the audience for joining us. Bye, Michael.
Bye-bye.